Well, hello and welcome to this English lesson about tiny things. As you know, when you look around you, you can see a lot of things, but there are really tiny things that if you want to see them, you have to look really close, or you need a microscope like this scientist is using in this picture. So, in the world around us, there are normal sized things, there are gigantic things, and there are also tiny, tiny things. And in this English lesson, I will explain a number of them. I'll do my best. A few of them are rather scientific, so I did look up the meaning for one or two of them, but they are all very common English vocabulary words that you will see and hear as you read the news and as you have English conversations. So, once again, welcome to this English lesson about tiny things. The head of a pin. So a pin is a small piece of metal, and sometimes when someone is fixing a piece of clothing, they will pin it together. When you put a piece of paper, I don't have a piece of paper here. Oh, I do. If I put a piece of paper on a bulletin board, I might put a pin in to hold it. But the top of the pin, the very top of the pin, is called the head of a pin. And the head of a pin is sometimes talked about as a tiny thing that's in the world around us. Sometimes people will say things like, oh, I can't remember the phrase, something about on the head of a pin. But anyways, a pin is a small thing. The head of a pin is a very tiny thing. It's hard to see unless you look at it really, really close up. And then the eye of a needle. So a needle is similar to a pin, but you can put thread through the eye, and then you can use the needle to sew things. If my button fell off, they're behind the microphone, if one of my buttons fell off, I would need to get a needle and thread, and then the tiny part of the needle is the eye. I would have to I think you do this. You make the thread wet, and then you put it through the eye of the needle. So the eye of a needle is a very tiny thing. I would then use the needle to sew my button back on. I haven't done that for a long time. It's one of the things my mom taught me to do before I went to university. She taught me how to do laundry, how to sew a button back on. She gave me a little needle and thread, and it came in handy. I became the person in my dorm who knew how to sew buttons back on. It's a good skill, by the way. Grains of sand. So if you go to the beach, here if I wanted to walk on the sand, I would go to the beach. Maybe you live in a country where there is desert. You would see a lot of sand. But if you look very, very closely at sand, it's made up of tiny, tiny grains. So we call them grains of sand. If you hold a bunch of sand in your hand, there would be millions of grains of sand there. So grain is also used to talk about things like wheat and barley and oats. We call those grains. But when we talk about sand, we also refer to it as grains of sand. Maybe you're walking along the beach and it's windy. You might get a grain of sand in your eye. That's not a pleasant feeling at all. And then specks of dust. So specks of dust are things you can see in the air when the sun shines through. Like in my house, there are times where the sun shines in the window, and then I can see little specks of dust in the air. They kind of float, and eventually you will have dust on top of things. There's a little bit of dust on top of my computer monitor. When I have lots of dust, I use this. This is my duster. I use this, dust you eyes off. I use this to dust things. Let me show you. And then I go outside and I spin it really fast. Actually, if I do it, I can see some specks of dust in the air. So anyways, tiny, tiny, tiny things that float in the air, we would call them specks of dust. And eventually they land on things and you do need to dust to clean them up. Bacteria. Now, I don't know a lot about bacteria except that they are very, very tiny organisms. They're alive and they are everywhere. There's bacteria on your skin. There's bacteria outside. If you, I'm trying to think, there's bacteria in your dog's mouth. Bacteria are everywhere. And this is one of the ones where I needed to, meaning of bacteria. and I forget, a member of a large group of unicellular microorganisms. So they're microorganisms which have cell walls but lack organelles. Oh, interesting. So that's your scientific explanation. Bacteria can sometimes cause infections. Bacteria can cause infections or disease. Some of them are bad for you. Some are beneficial. So anyways, bacteria, very tiny, tiny, tiny organisms that live in the world around us. And I mentioned unicellular. A more common term would probably be single-celled organisms. So single-celled organisms are very, very tiny. So organism is like a word for, I was going to say similar to animal, but it's not really an animal. It's anything that's alive, that's alive. That's what I'll say. And some of them only have one cell. We are multi-celled organisms. We have many, many cells. In fact, we have skin cells and we have all kinds of cells in our body. But there are some tiny, tiny, tiny organisms which are single-celled. And then, of course, viruses. Viruses. Uh-oh, I'm the English teacher. Plural of virus. And I have to look up. Let's see here. Hackers like to use viri as a plural, but scholars object and say that it is viruses. Interesting. Anyways, these things are annoying. When a virus is going around, it makes people sick. I think we're all familiar with a very common virus that recently went around the world. It's very annoying when a virus spreads. Sometimes at school, one kid is sick because they have a virus and they spread it to some other kids. And then pretty soon, everyone in class is sick. Atoms. So we're getting away from the living world into what are called the building blocks of the world. Everything around us is made from atoms. They're like the smallest thing that you can have. Well, they have parts, like they have protons and neutrons and electrons, but an atom is kind of the building block. Everything is made out of atoms in the world around us. This was one of my favorite science classes in school when we learned about molecules and atoms and the periodic table of elements. And then we learned things like if you take oxygen and hydrogen, and if they are in a molecule like this, it's called H2O, which is water. So this is a water molecule and it is made up of tiny, tiny atoms. I don't think we can see atoms and molecules. I don't know if microscopes are that powerful. Maybe a super powerful microscope, but I am teaching English, not science. So I don't know. Maybe Dave the Canadian or Brent knows if we can see atoms and molecules yet. I don't think we can. I think we know they're there, but I'm not sure we can actually see them. Particles. So particles is an interesting word. It can be used to talk about specific things. Like there's a particle accelerator in Europe where they accelerate different particles, very, very, very tiny things. Okay. We also use it to talk about things like dust. When I said there were specks of dust in the air, I could say there were particles in the air. We also use it to talk about things like a firework. When a firework goes off, a lot of particles come out and then they're on fire. When I grind metal, a lot of particles fly off. But generally for me, the word particle is not something I use a lot. It's a general term to talk about small things. Usually I use it to talk about dust. Like there's wildfires in Northern Ontario, so there's a lot of smoke particles in the air. The last few days have been good, but there have been smoke particles in the air. So that's where you'll hear that word a lot, to talk about very, very tiny things, usually in the air around us. Cells. So we are made out of cells. Pretty much every living thing is made out of some kind of cells. These are red blood cells. These are the blood cells that flow in our blood and do things like deliver oxygen, I think. You have to have healthy red blood cells in order to be healthy. What do red blood cells do? Red blood cells carry oxygen from the lungs and deliver it through the body. Okay, good. I was right. I did research all of these last night, but I think I'm too tired to remember. So cells are very tiny. You can see cells through a microscope. I do remember in science class in high school when we first used a microscope, the teacher had special slides made up of something with large enough cells that you could see it with a microscope, some kind of single-celled organism probably, and it was very, very fun. But these are red blood cells. They are something that work very hard in your body to keep you healthy and to keep you oxygenated, I guess would be the word, to deliver oxygen through your body. Strands of human hair. So we often talk about things that are tiny and reference the human hair. So we might say things like, this is thinner than a human hair, or this is a little bit thicker than a strand of human hair. So we often refer to hair as a strand of hair. So these are strands, and you might have one strand of human hair, and you might say they've invented a new material, and the fibers or the strands are smaller than a human hair. So we often use the thickness of a human hair to talk about other things as comparison. Pollen. So right now in our fields, there are lots of flowers. In fact, this week's coming lesson on Tuesday, I talk about one thing. I talk about learning English, but I made the lesson in the flower field. So you'll see lots of flowers. Flowers have pollen, and pollen is just really, really tiny, tiny, tiny part of the plant that bees come around and collect, and other insects. Pollen is something that you can get pollen on your hand, and sometimes it stains your hand. That can happen with things like dandelions. There's a little bit of yellow pollen on the top. But pollen is a tiny part of the plant that has a function in reproduction, but also something that bees collect. Dust. So I mentioned that there are specks of dust, but there's just dust in general. In the world around us, anywhere you go, there will be dust. Dust comes from people walking on dirt and gravel. Dust comes from just making stuff in your kitchen. Dust comes from the human body. Our skin, slowly pieces fall off. So all around us there is dust, and we often, I think I dusted here the other day because I can't actually find any dust. It will settle, and then in order to get rid of dust, you have to dust. So the act of getting rid of dust is called dusting. It's something you do to get rid of dust. Crumbs. So this is something I'm very familiar with. When you eat food, sometimes little pieces of the food fall on your plate or on the table or on the counter. When you have a lot of crumbs, sometimes you get ants because they want to eat the crumbs. But crumbs refer to tiny, tiny, tiny pieces of food, usually from drier food like bread or crackers or chips. The small, small pieces at the bottom of a chip bag would be called crumbs. Maybe when you take a bite of a cookie, a really crunchy cookie, some crumbs might fall out when you do that. And that's pretty crummy when that happens. That's another word we use. So crummy just means not very nice. Like, I had a crummy day. It doesn't mean there were lots of crumbs in your day. It just means you had a bad day. But yes, crumbs, usually from dry food, like crackers or dry cookies, those kinds of things, you will have some crumbs. So sugar crystals and salt crystals. There are two things that we as humans use a lot of as we prepare food. We use a lot of sugar, which if you look at very, 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 very closely, you will see tiny, tiny little, almost like cubes, so little crystals. And if you want something sweet, you use sugar. If you want it to be a little more salty, you use salt. And the same thing here. If you look at salt really, really closely, you will see little like geometric three-dimensional shapes, which we call crystals. So sugar makes things sweet. I like sugar. Salt makes things salty. Generally, there are two types of people in the world. when it comes to snacks. There are people who really like eating things that are sweet, and we say they have a sweet tooth. And there are people who really like eating salty things, and we say they like eating salty things. I don't think there is a word for that. So I like cookies. I like cake. I like ice cream. Jen likes chips. She likes pretzels. She likes tortilla chips. So I'm definitely someone who likes sweets, and Jen likes things that are salty, which is good. So we don't eat each other's snacks as often. I will eat salty stuff too, though. But droplets. So this is another one that might be familiar to you because of the recent pandemic. Droplets are very, very tiny drops. So if you turn your kitchen tap on a little bit, it will drip. A little drop will fall every couple of seconds. It'll go bink, bink, bink. It might drive you crazy. So that's called a drop. But when we have a really, really, really small drop, we call it a droplet. When you sneeze, or even when you cough, small droplets come out. So again, these are liquid. So it's either your saliva or something else. It can be water droplets as well. But whenever we have really, really, really small drops, we call them droplets. And the difference between a drop and a drop will fall. A droplet is so small, it will kind of float in the air for a little bit. I think it will eventually fall, but it's so tiny. It's just a little tiny water droplet. It will just float around, which is what makes droplets dangerous when there's a disease going around, when there's a sickness that can spread through droplets. That's why we had to wear masks, to stop droplets from coming out and spreading. Lint. If you look in your pocket, you probably have lint. Lint is this really funny stuff that forms when you wear different clothes and fabrics. So if you look in the pocket, especially in the pocket of a pair of blue jeans, you will most likely find pieces of lint. So it's this really soft, it's usually blue when you're wearing blue jeans. It's kind of a hint. This kind of shirt doesn't usually make a lot of lint. This is a very tightly woven fabric, but definitely, let's see, is there any lint in my short pocket right now? Yep, there's a little piece of lint. I don't think I can make the camera focus on this. We'll try though. Will it focus? Oh, I have to get my head out of the way. There we go. Nah, it won't quite focus. Come on, Mr. Camera. Maybe if I do it this way. I know you're not that interested in seeing the lint that came out of Bob's pocket. Yeah, there's a tiny piece of lint there on the end of my finger. There we go. I'll just put that over here. I think that lint will eventually become dust if it gets small enough. But lint is something that it must happen while you wash clothes as well. It gathers. Pebbles. So pebbles are just tiny stones or rocks. They don't have to be super small, but when we go to the beach, we like to go to a beach where there's sand, but all of the beaches that are the closest, the beaches that are really close to me, actually have stones or rocky beaches, and there's a lot of pebbles. So a pebble then is just a very, very tiny rock. Usually when I think of a pebble, it's usually round and not jagged. So jagged would mean it's not nice to walk on. So usually for me, pebbles are things you find at the beach, and they're usually somewhat small and round. Pennies. So I don't have a penny here. In Canada, we don't use pennies anymore, but pennies would be, I was just going to say they're the tiniest coin, but they're not. The dime is actually tinier. Let's see if, there we go. There's a Canadian dime. This is the Blue Nose, which was a famous ship. There we go. Hopefully I got that right. And then we still have on the back of our dimes, we have Queen Elizabeth. I think we're going to start to have King Charles on our coins soon. But yes, our dime, Canadian dime ship. Our dime is tiny. And on the dime it has, let me see here. It features the Blue Nose, which is a famous racing ship, I think. I don't know enough about my coin to talk about it, but I put pennies up there. But our smallest, tiniest coin is actually our dime, and we stopped using pennies a few years ago. You can still bring them to the bank if you need to, but other than that, they are just out of service. Everything in our stores they just round it up and down. So they round it to the next 5 cent. The fine print, or like I like to say, the fine print or ingredients or the instructions on a pill bottle, there are some really tiny, tiny words in the world. Fine print refers to when you sign a legal document, sometimes at the bottom, there's a few things written in really small letters, and it's called the fine print. And it's always important to read the fine print. And again, the other place you might find really tiny, tiny words would be whenever I have to read a pill bottle, I have trouble reading the actual instructions, which worries me because old people take a lot of pills and old people also can't see very well. So that's why I use reading glasses. Pixels. Hey, if you look really, really closely at your phone screen or at a computer screen, it's made up of tiny little pixels. They're little squares or rectangles. Sometimes it's 3 little rectangles in a square with 3 different colors. But that is what is used to make the image you're seeing. You think you're seeing Bob the Canadian right now, but you're actually seeing a whole bunch of really tiny pixels, and your brain interprets it as a video or a live lesson of Bob the Canadian. So pixels are the tiniest, tiniest dot on every screen. And when you talk about screen resolution, like this, I think I'm live streaming at 1080p. So there's 1080 pixels from top to bottom of this screen. So let's count them. 1, 2, 3. I'm just kidding. If you have any kind of photo editing software, if you zoom in really, really close with the zoom tool, you will actually see the pixels in something. Dots. So dots is a general term to refer to anything that's tiny and usually round. This ladybug has dots on its back. I'm trying to think of another thing that has dots on it. Oh, if you have dice. I actually got some out just for this. So this dice has dots on it. So you see the little round things on it. If I roll this, it will come up with a number. You will count the dots, and that's how you know what number you rolled. Filings. So on the farm, sometimes I use a grinder, or sometimes I use a file to work on something that is metal. And then I will have iron filings, or there will be filings all around. Filings are very, very tiny pieces of metal, usually steel. If you look here, this magnet is picking up the filings because they are metal, so they are attracted to the magnet. But definitely, the other day I was working on something where I was using my grinder, and then there were a lot of sparks, and then there were also a lot of filings, so I swept them up when I was done. So usually we use the word filings to talk about small, tiny pieces of metal. Sparks are very small. Sometimes when you are having a fire, you will see sparks. There's flames, but you'll see sparks as well. And sometimes when you work on metal like this person, you can see that there are sparks flying off of whatever they are working on. So sparks glow. So they're very, very hot and very, very tiny. Seeds. This is one of my favorite ones because I'm a flower farmer. Seeds are tiny, and when you put them in the ground, and when they get some warmth and when they get some water, they will grow. So when you have things like sunflowers, they will bloom, and eventually you can get the sunflower seeds, and you can either eat them, they're yummy, or the next year you can plant them in the ground, water them, and if you have some warm, sunny days, eventually the seed will grow into another sunflower. It's very, very cool. It's probably the most amazing thing that I know about, the ability of plants to reproduce. Very cool. Miniatures. So there is a whole world of hobbyists. So there's not a whole world of hobbyists. There is a hobby where people collect miniatures and they paint miniatures. I've never done this, but you can go to stores and you can buy tiny, tiny little characters and then you can paint them yourself. And these are called miniatures. So anytime we take something and make it smaller, we call it a miniature. There used to be a miniature village close to me. It was a place where they had there was an Eiffel Tower there, by the way. They had all different buildings from around the world, but they were very small. Like I was taller than the Eiffel Tower because it was a miniature. So I'm not saying miniature. Some people do say that. I say miniature. Okay, so there's miniature village. That's what it was called. It was cool. It's gone now, which is sad. I would take my kids there if it was still there. Nanobots. Nanobots would be very tiny, tiny robots. You usually hear about nanobots when you're watching some sort of science fiction show or a science fiction movie, or if you're reading a book about science fiction. We have not gotten very far in the creation of nanobots. You can see these little tiny robots are smaller than a red blood cell. I don't think we're capable of doing that yet. But a nanobot would be a very, very, very tiny, tiny robot. Someday, I think we will probably use nanobots to do a bunch of really, really cool things. Fleas, ants, aphids. I'm not going to list every single tiny insect, but fleas are something that you will find on dogs and cats. Oscar and Walter actually take a special pill once a month, which stops them from getting fleas and ticks. So that's very, very nice. But a flea is a little tiny insect that will live on an animal's skin and kind of live off of them. Ants are everywhere. I think they might be one of the most common insects in the world. Sometimes when we leave crumbs on the counter, we get ants in our kitchen. Not very nice. I don't like that. And then we currently have a lot of aphids. Aphids are really, really tiny insects that live on a plant, and they will suck they'll suck the life out of the plant. That's what we'll say about aphids. They drink the plant's juice, and it's very, very bad for plants. But eventually, ladybugs come, and I think the ladybugs kill the aphids. And in our oceans, there is a lot of plankton. Plankton is what whales eat. It's kind of funny that one of the, if not the biggest animal, eats some of the smallest animals. But plankton refers to all kinds of tiny, tiny, tiny sea life that whales and other animals will eat. What is plankton? Let's get a good scientific definition. Plankton are drifters, organisms that are simply carried along by the waters of the ocean. Let's see here. Plankton are a diverse collection of organisms found in water or in the air, most commonly in water though, that do not propel themselves but just ride along. They include bacteria, algae, protozoa, small animals, so a lot of different things. And do whales eat them? Should we check that? Let's see here. Whale. Let's see here. They are the important, crucial source of food for many small and large organisms, such as fish and whales. There you go. Plankton. Now you know. I didn't know plankton could be in the air, though. In my mind, plankton is always in the ocean, but maybe I just don't know enough. But they're tiny, so they fit in this lesson.